Hey everybody, this is Games Plus James, and today we're going to take a look at adding a wall jump mechanic to your game. So the ability to grab onto a wall and then jump and push away and fly up as you go to allow your players to get to higher places in your games. And before we dive into making this system work, don't forget to go and wishlist our game Skookaboom and the Tomb of Doom, which you can see on screen here on Steam right now. It's coming out in a few months and it really needs some awesome people to wishlist the game, which really helps it out and lets you know when the game will be released and lets you know when it goes on a discounted sale when it first launches and things like that. So go right there to the link on screen and wishlist the game today, and in the meantime let's go ahead and dive in and make this wall jumping system work. Okay, so I've got this starter project set up. You can download this and follow along yourself in the description, or follow with the link in the description down below if you want to, or you can just follow with your own projects, it doesn't matter. But just a quick demonstration, all we've got set up here is a little room with some various different bits of stuff to walk on, but of course at the moment if I go near a wall nothing happens. Now the way I have this set up is a fairly simple player controller script on this guy, and he uses a little point at his feet. If I zoom in on him here, there's a little point down here which is what checks whether we're on the ground. So we're going to do something very similar for our wall jumps. So obviously to do any of this wall jump stuff, we're going to do some changes to our player controller code. So let's dive into the code and see what that looks like at the moment. So as I said, it's a very simple 2D character controller. We've got a rigid body that we move and jump around. We've got a point that we check whether we're on the ground. It does a little down here where we degrounded. It does an overlap circle to check if it's touching anything that we have marked as ground in this layer mask. And then we tell the animator to do different animations. So very simple and very easy to do. And we're going to do something similar with our wall jumping. So we're going to do another check to the side of the player and check if we're touching against the wall. And then if we're also pressing in a direction towards that wall, then we will say, hey, at this point we should be marking ourselves as wall grabbing. And then we can, from that point, we're able to jump away from there. So let's set that stuff up. So first thing I'm going to do is create a couple of variables up here. So I'm going to create a public transform that I'll call wall grab point. So as I said, this will be the point where we're checking to see if we're touching against a wall. Then we're going to have a couple of private bools. So we're going to have one for telling us if we can grab at the moment. So basically it's checking if there's a wall there. And then we'll also keep track of whether we are currently grabbing at the moment. So is grabbing. And for the moment, that's what we're going to do with those. So let's just go back into Unity and I'm going to assign this. So we'll jump back in here, go to our player. Once that compiles, you can see I already have a wall grab point here set up. So if I zoom in, you can see it's this little spot here. If I hit my little transform tool here, you can see that the point that we're doing is basically just at the edge of this little box that we have set up for the player. So we'll assign that to the wall grab points slot there, and we'll go back in here. And what we're going to do is, after I handle switching the player around and stuff like that, I'm going to say in here, let's just write a comment, handle wall jumping. That's what this whole next section is going to be about. And I'm going to say our can grab value, our can grab bool, is going to be equal to a physics 2D dot overlap circle. And for an overlap circle, we need to tell it where it goes from, and that's going to be our wall grab point dot position. How big we want it to be, let's just make it 0.2, so it's relatively small. And what are we going to be interacting with? Well, our walls, if I go back in here, our walls are basically the same thing as our ground here at the moment. So if I go to my grid that I have here and I go to my tile map, you can see it's on the layer ground. So we're going to use the same ground check layer for our walls as our ground here. So we already have on our player a layer mask for what is ground. So we're just going to use that again for the moment. And we're just going to say what is ground. So we're checking to see, hey, is there anything that we can touch against, basically. So if there's anything that this circle will overlap, then that means we're able to grab because we're touching against the wall. The next thing we're going to do is check and see if we should activate is grabbing mode. So we're basically saying, hey, should we mark it that we are grabbing onto the wall? And that's going to happen when we're pushing against the wall. So first thing we need to know is first of all, can we grab at the moment? So if we can grab, so if it's possible that we could grab onto a wall, we also want to make sure we're not on the ground. So and not is grounded. So we're not on the ground. Then what we're going to do is check and see if we are pressing towards the wall. So how do we know which direction we're pressing, for example? So if we're facing to the right, we obviously want to only grab onto the wall if we're pressing to the right. And the way I have it set up here is we are flipping the local scale of our player depending on what direction we're facing. So when we're facing to the right, the local scale is 1 on the x-axis, and when we're facing to the left, the local scale is -1 on the axis. And the reason I do that here is simply because it makes it easy to flip this wall grab point around. So I can just, if I have this highlighted here and I turn off maximize, if I press play, and if you watch the player, when we're moving to the right, the point is on the right of the player. When we move to the left, the point is on the left of the player. So it's a very simple way to determine which side we're grabbing on. So let's go back in here, and in here we can say if our transform.local scale .x is equal to 1, well, that means that we're facing to the right, because that's if our rigid body velocity is above .x is above 0, that means we're moving to the right, and we're setting the local scale x to be 1. So if it is 1, then that means we're moving to the right, or facing to the right. And if our input dot get axis raw horizontal is greater than 0, so basically if we're facing to the right and we're pressing to the right, then in here we can say is grabbing is true. So at that point we would be saying, hey, we're grabbing onto the wall. But obviously we also want to do this for when we're facing left, so we could add another if statement here to check it, or we could simply add in to this. So I'm just going to wrap all of this here in another set of brackets. There we go. I couldn't remember the word brackets there for a second. I'm just going to copy it. I'm going to put an OR in here. And this time, instead of the local scale x being 1, I'm going to say if it's -1 and our horizontal axis is less than 0. So that basically if we're facing left and we're pushing left, then also they will say it's true. So either if we're facing right and pushing right, this will be true, or if we're facing left and pushing left, this will also be marked as true. So one other thing we're going to do is, before we set this, we're going to go up here, and every frame we're going to make sure that is grabbing is reset to be false. So we set it before we do this, so that way we know that it'll only be marked as true whenever we're actively grabbing on to a wall. Okay, so with that done, we can then say down here, we can handle what should happen when we are grabbing onto the wall. So for the moment, I'm just going to say if is grabbing is true, then set the rigid body's gravity scale, which is what controls how fast we fall down. We're going to set that to be 0. So we'll just freeze in space. Okay, so let's save that and we'll go back into Unity and see this in action. We should see the basics now of grabbing onto the wall working. So I'm going to go here and press play. And let's do this to maximize again. There we go. And if I now jump and grab onto the wall, you can see, well, what happened there? We did grab onto the wall, and we're now in a state where our gravity is 0, because you can see we're floating, but we went flying up the wall. And why did that happen? Well, because when we go back in here, when we jump, which is what we're doing here, when we first jumped towards the wall, we obviously had an upward velocity. But then here, when we set our gravity scale to be 0, that means, hey, there's no more force pushing us downwards, so our rigid body velocity just keeps pushing us up into the air. So we need to make sure when we set the gravity to 0, we also set our velocity to 0. So the rigid body dot velocity equals vector 2.0, which is a shortcut way to write a new vector 2 with x and y both being 0. So if I press play again, jump and grab onto the wall, perfect. We're now holding onto the wall. But of course the problem is, we can't jump off the wall, but also you've noticed that I'm just hovering here at this point. We really want it so that when we're not grabbing onto the wall, our player should fall back down again, at least. So let's go back in here. We're going to go up the top and add a new variable, a private float gravity store. And this is just going to store whatever gravity setting we have on the rigid body. So in our start function, we're just going to say gravity store equals the rigid body dot gravity scale. And then down here, when we grab on and we set it to 0, we're going to say else. So if we're not grabbing on, then the rigid body gravity scale equals gravity store. Okay, so save this, go back in, and we should see that this now will allow us to grab onto the wall and fall back down again. So if I press play, run over here and grab onto the wall and then let go, there we go, we're falling back down to the ground. So perfect, that much is working. We have our wall grabbing working, but obviously we can't jump off just yet. And also this little animation of him just kind of in his jump pose doesn't look great. So let's make sure that our animation will work correctly. So I already have in my animator over here an animation added for the player grabbing onto the wall. If I go to my animations view here with the sprite object selected and I go to player wall grab, if I preview this animation, you can see it's simply just one frame of the player looking like they're hanging onto the wall like that. If I go back to my animator, so at the moment I have a bool set up here for is grabbing, and if that becomes true, then we switch from jumping to going to the wall grab animation, and if it's false, we go from wall grab back to jumping. So let's make that happen in our code very, very simply. Here where I'm doing all the other animation settings, I'm just going to say anim.set bool is grabbing, which is the bool we had back there, and I'm going to use the is grabbing bool we set up to put in that information. There we go, and we'll just save this, jump back in, and that should now look a little bit better once it compiles. And jump and grab on. There we go. So now it actually looks like he's grabbing onto the wall. Okay, so that's perfect. The next thing we need to do is make it so that we can actually jump away from the wall. So let's dive back into our script first of all, and let's just talk about how we're going to make this work. One of the best ways that I found personally to handle wall jumps is to essentially take away control from the player for a very, very short fraction of time. So what we're going to do is when the player presses the jump button, obviously we're going to make them move up into the air, but for a very short frame of time, say about 0.2 of a second, we're going to make the player move away from the wall, and we won't allow any input to happen during that time. So basically they start jumping away from the wall and we can't do anything else just for the moment. So let's go up the top here and we're going to add a couple of variables in. So I'm going to add a public float wall jump time, and I'm going to set that to be 0.2 by default. We can play around with that obviously in the editor. And I'm going to have a private float called wall jump counter. And what we're going to do is down here where we're grabbing onto the wall, in this bit here where we know we're grabbing on here, we're going to do a check and see if input.get button down jump. So this is the exact same as I have up here for when we press the jump button, and there I'm checking if I'm on the ground obviously. But here we're just going to check if we are grabbing at the moment and we press the jump button. Well, then what we want to do is we're going to make our counter, so wall jump counter will be equal to our wall jump time. And so the way we're going to remove control from the player is make it so that all of this stuff that we have up here will be inside a if our wall jump counter is less than or equal to 0. So if it's less than or equal to 0, we're able to do all the normal movement that we have here. And then down at the very bottom, we're going to put an else to say if our wall jump counter is above 0, then make it count down. So wall jump counter minus equals time dot delta time. So this way we're setting it to be 0.2 of a second, and then for 0.2 of a second we can't do any input and it'll just count down, and then it'll go back to being able to do normal input. And then within here, what we're going to say is when we set that time, we're also going to give us a velocity upwards. So we're going to push our player up into the air. So we're going to have a rigid body dot velocity equals a new vector 2. We'll return to the x-axis in a moment, but let's just set the y-axis is going to be the same as we have for jumping up here, which is this jump force variable. So jump force. And then on the x-axis, we know that we're pushing our controller is pushing towards the wall, or our player is pushing towards the wall. So if we're attached to a wall on the right, we're pushing to the right, and if we're attached to a wall on the left, we're pushing to the left. So we also know that when we're wall jumping, we want to jump away from that direction. So if we're pushing to the right, we want to make sure that our player jumps to the left. And if we're pushing to the left, we want to make sure we jump to the right. And how we can do that is very simply by taking our input dot get axis raw on the horizontal axis and making that a minus value. So now if we're pushing to the right, it switches to pushing to the left, and if we're pushing to the left, it switches to pushing to the right. So minus this value, and we're going to multiply that by our move speed, so how fast we're moving. So that will apply a force to our character to push him away from the wall and allow us to actually start count. And at that point, it'll allow us to start counting down the wall jump counter. But of course, one really important thing to note is when we apply this force to the character, we have our wall jump counter here counting down, which means that we'll stop grabbing, which will be fine, but our rigid body gravity scale won't be reset to the gravity store because this whole section won't be being carried out. So in essence, what'll happen, we'll have this velocity and our player will shoot off. Might go a little bit too fast for our desires. So we don't want that to happen. So essentially what we just need to make sure we do is when we apply that force to the rigid body, we'll also turn back on the gravity. So the rigid body, that gravity scale equals gravity store. And then most importantly, we'll also say our is grabbing variable is false. And obviously that doesn't make any difference to adding jumping and stuff like that, because this section of code won't be run while the counter is counting down. But the important thing is that this, by making this false, it will now tell the animator that is false so that the animator can switch out of the wall grab animation. Okay, so let's save this and we should see this in action then. So let that compile. And then when we press play, we should see we can grab onto the wall, and when I jump, it forces the player away from the wall. So perfect, that's working the way we want it to. Our player is wall grabbing the exact way they should be. I'm pretty happy with how that works. We can wall jump, we can do these kind of triangle jumps, I think they're called commonly, to go up the wall as we go. Now, just looking at this in action here, I actually feel like that 0.2 might be a little bit too long on the player. So let's go to our player, and I'm going to adjust this down to 0.1. The point is to give the player a little bit of time to get away from the wall. So now when I do this, there we go, that feels a little bit better. So now it looks like they're actually kind of hopping up the wall as they go. Okay, so perfect. That's how our wall jump works. But one extra limitation we can also add on to this is that you'll commonly see in games with a wall jump mechanic is to only allow wall jumping at certain areas. So we can do that very, very simply. I'm going to stop this running here. And if I go to my grid, I already have set up a specific wall grab layer here. So if I turn this on, you can see it's only got a couple of areas. It's got one little bit here and one little bit here. They've got their own colliders set up on them correctly. And they're assigned to a wall grab layer specifically. And what we can do is very easily go to our player, go back into our player controller script, and up the top we're going to add a new layer mask. So we were already using, for our can grab variable, we're already using the what is ground, which would be perfectly fine in most situations. But if you want to have a specific area for this, we're going to have to use another public layer mask called, we'll call it what is grabbable. and we're going to switch this out for that. So what is grabbable? It sounds like a fun word to say as well, grabbable. It just kind of falls out of your mouth a little bit. Anyway, continuing on here, let's go back into our Unity, and we're going to say what is grabbable. We're going to set this to be wall grab. And now when I press play, if I jump over here, I can no longer grab onto this wall, but if I jump here, I can grab onto this specific area that we have set up and marked as wall grabbable. I've actually now fallen into this hole, which doesn't let me get back out, so let's just stop that running for a second and just verify that it works on the other wall as well. So now, any area that you mark with the layer wall grab, that was the layer, wasn't it? Yes, wall grab. Any layer that you mark with that, the player will be able to grab onto, and anything that doesn't, won't let the player grab on. And there you go. That's how we can add wall grabbing into our games. Very, very simple, but actually makes games feel quite a lot of fun, as is a very fun mechanic to add in to your games. So there you go. Thanks for watching this video. Don't forget to go and wishlist Skookaboom at the link in the description down below. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button, like, all that fun stuff. Join us on Discord, join us on Twitter, everywhere you possibly can. Keep being awesome, keep being amazing, and I'll see you all very soon.